6 weeks ago I started a new series in The Planet on Substack, offering another historic and often European perspective on America's flirt with fascism. On this side of the Atlantic we've tried out both communism and fascism in the last century, and it's now a bit like, been there, done that, and no please, never again. But it seems like, as any child growing up, countries go through phases of history without taking into account the lessons learned from the past in other countries. It's a pity, but history never develops along a straight line, and although it often follows patterns, they don't predict very well, but they help to put events into context. And the current series is about the Strongman's Playbook. And I originally had the title in mind, Dictatorship for Dummies. You know those yellow covered books you always see when you want to learn something. It might be on the bedside table of Donald Trump, but maybe it's something else. It might be Stephen Miller or one of those guys that whispers in his ear how to be a dictator or how to become one. So this series followed on my earlier series, which was called After the Fall, where I examined how difficult and often painful it is to achieve justice once a country returns to a democratic system. And then we made one step back. Instead of after the fall, the focus became the necessary first step, which is the fall itself. How does the fall of a regime happen? And then we took one more step back in time to look at the functioning of a regime. And that's where the Strongman's Playbook started. So how do you run a dictatorship? Well, it turns out that all over the world, patterns are followed. Learn to recognize those patterns and you understand much better what you will read in the news tomorrow or next week. 6 weeks ago when I started with covering the courts because they are often the first target for the strongman. And then the media. And then 4 weeks ago I wrote about the business elite, and then I focused the next week on the civil service. And 2 weeks ago I wrote about how to weaponize the law. And last week it was about rewriting history. And this week we moved to the seventh technique in the Strongman's Playbook, and that is manufacturing the enemy. Each of these topics is worth a separate book. And there are so many examples to choose from. So let me start with a sentence from a presidential debate, and I'm sure that you'll recognize it. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. Now, the moderator fact-checked Trump on air. Springfield's city manager told ABC there were no credible reports of any pet ever having been harmed by immigrants. Local police denied it too, and the woman behind the original Facebook post, she retracted it. Now, PolitiFact named the claim its 2024 lie of the year. But Trump kept repeating it. He did it so often that you will most likely remember it. Springfield, Ohio then faced bomb threats at schools and government buildings. And the city that had welcomed workers from Haiti into its factories and its economy was then reduced in public consciousness to an image of pet-eating immigrants that had been fully debunked before it even spread. Now that is the technique in its most simple form. The claim does not need to be true. It wasn't true, of course. It just needs to be vivid and frightening and politically functional. The debunking then spreads the story. And the repetition makes the claim feel substantial. The fear circulates regardless of the facts. Last week, on the evening of July 16, this technique scaled up to a primetime presidential address. Trump claimed China had stolen the voter data of 220 million Americans and then used it to manipulate the 2020 election. He released declassified documents as proof. However, those documents did not support the claim. The intelligence community's own assessment concluded China had not attempted to change vote totals. And John Solomon, who's a conservative commentator that Trump had brought onto his White House staff, he said the intelligence community had zero evidence that any foreign power had flipped a vote. Why the escalation now? Trump's approval numbers are weak. The midterms are approaching and the party in power typically loses seats in the midterms. And add to that his record on the cost of living, on housing, on healthcare, that has consistently failed to gather any enthusiasm. He cannot run on the economy, so he needs an enemy. Because a president under attack by existential threats cannot be judged by grocery prices, right? Now, the same week, Secretary of State Rubio convened a summit of 66 nations focused almost entirely on left-wing political violence. He called leftists enemies of civilization and an encroaching darkness. Stephen Miller said their civil rights claims must fall on deaf ears. And Reuters has documented that Trump has invoked communism 81 times in just 2 weeks. And this is not random. Political scientists who study democratic backsliding, like Ruth Van-Geert and Timothy Snyder, who are excellent on Substack, read their work, they have noted that authoritarian movements almost always expand their enemy lists over time. It starts with one group and then incorporates every institution that tries to protect them. And the important fact is not which group is named first. The important fact is that the list keeps growing, and that growing list keeps justifying growing powers. Viktor Orbán built his government in Hungary on two manufactured enemies. The first one was George Soros, who was turned from a philanthropist into a puppet master of a globalist conspiracy. There were billboard campaigns across Hungary, laws for criminalizing assistance to asylum seekers, and the Central European University was expelled. And the second main enemy next to George Soros were the migrants. They were transformed from a policy issue into an existential civilizational invasion of Hungary. The emergency never ended because the point was never to solve the emergency. It's worth noting why this worked in Hungary specifically, because Hungarians lived under actual communist rule until 1989, and the fear of foreign ideological influence, of hidden networks, of institutions captured by outside forces, that was not invented. Orbán activated something real in the collective memory of a country that had really experienced those things. Now, the mistake that Trump makes is to blindly copy the framing of Orbán. But the Reuters focus groups confirm that the communist framing works less well on younger Americans who did not live through the Cold War. Orbán governed for 16 years on those manufactured enemies. Now, this year in April, he was defeated. Hungary proved that an illiberal democracy can be beaten at the ballot box. Péter Magyar won a 2/3 majority, and he has moved quickly to dismantle Orbán's captured institutions. Now here's the detail that arrived yesterday, just when I was finishing writing the article in The Planet. Reuters reported that Orbán has announced a resistance movement against Magyar's new government, accusing him of establishing a tyranny. So, to recap, for 16 years, Orbán portrayed NGOs, Brussels, George Soros, migrants, the opposition, whatever, as existential threats to Hungary. But now, he's portraying the democratically elected government as the existential threat. So it's clear that the manufactured enemy technique does not retire when the practitioner loses office. It just continues in the opposition. It is the only political language that he knows. Let's move to Brazil, where Bolsonaro built his career on a communist conspiracy so comprehensive that any institution checking his power automatically became part of it. And when he lost the 2022 election, his supporters stormed Congress and the Supreme Court. Now, in September 2025, Brazil's Supreme Court convicted him on 5 accounts and sentenced him to 27 years and 3 months. He is serving that sentence under house arrest for health reasons with strict conditions. Luckily, the institution is held long enough in Brazil. I have a friend from Albania to give one more other example, and she grew up under Enver Hoxha's communist state. And she told me everyone knew the system was built on lies. They could watch Italian television illegally. so they could see how different life was on the outside of Albania. And still the system held for decades because the cost of resistance was too high and the mechanisms were too interlocked. And that is what I think about when I watch America. I see real signs of hope, but I also see how patient the strategy is. How each step that meets too much resistance is then withdrawn and then tried again. And how each institution captured makes the next one harder to defend. The manufactured enemy does not require belief, it requires circulation. The enemy is manufactured to justify attacking institutions, and the institutions are attacked to prevent them from exposing the enemy as manufactured. And that's the circle that we're in. So please like, share and subscribe so you will receive part 8 in the Planet newsletter on Substack next week. I would love to have more subscribers and readers here. So that's what you can do if you like these kind of videos. In part 8 next week, we will move to buying the base as the 8th theme in the 10 topics that we will discuss in this series. Hope to see you there.